So you've been having back pain with deadlifting. Let's talk about how to fix that. As a physical therapist and someone who has experienced low back pain myself when lifting, let me assure you that you will get back to lifting pain-free and that it won't take that long. In this video, we're going to talk about technique with deadlifting, as well as some common mistakes or breakdowns in form that we will see, compensations that people tend to have when they have tight muscles, as well as using a belt and stabilizing your core, and then what time of day you should lift. The last one might sound a little strange, but it actually does matter for some people. We're going to start with technique because that is most likely the issue here. One of the more common issues we see with a deadlift is that people will try and hold the weight out in front of them a little bit. Ideally, the bar should trace your leg as it goes up. If you hold it out in front of you, this places more stress on the low back because it causes more torque. So compare this lift on the left versus the lift on the right. On the left, you can see that I keep the weight close to my body, and then on the right, I hold the weight out in front of me a little bit. Now, obviously that's a kettlebell and not a bar, but the fact remains that the farther out in front of you you hold it, the more stress on the low back. Look at the equation for torque. Torque will be the force on the low back, and you can calculate this by taking the radius, which is the distance from the bar to the center of the low back, times the force, and that is just gravity times the mass of what you're lifting. With the radius, the bigger this is, you multiply that by the force, and then that is the torque on the low back. So the farther out you hold the weight, the worse it'll be. Another issue with technique is that people are not keeping their low back in a perfectly neutral position throughout the lift. You've probably seen somebody who lets the low back bend forward slightly when deadlifting. Now this happens because the muscles are not strong enough to keep the back in a neutral position. Now when we're not in this neutral position, the low back has an increased chance of injury. Imagine the low back is a pillar. The more vertical it is, the stronger it is when you apply force to the top. If you bend a little bit and then apply that same force, you're going to get a break at some point along that curve. So the straighter the back is, the more innate stability there is as the bones stack on top of each other. The farther bent it is, the more you rely on muscles to stabilize. Once these muscles get tired, they can no longer support the back, and that will cause an injury. The last big issue with technique that I've seen is that people like to overextend their back at the top of the lift. What this will look like is you'll stand straight up and then you'll arch your back backwards. I don't know why people do this because technically the lift is over once you're standing straight up. All this does is pull the back into a non-neutral position, like we talked about before. It's just bending the other way. But the same principle applies, that the back is not best suited to hold this weight at this angle. Really tight hamstrings can also cause issues when deadlifting. If the hamstring is so tight that we can't actually reach down all the way and grab the bar without bending the low back, we're going to have problems, just like we talked about before, with the back in a bent position. Now this is most likely an issue if you're doing Romanian deadlifts. If they are really tight, you don't need to go all the way down, because once the hamstrings max out in length, the low back will have to bend forward in order for you to keep going. Now a good way to stretch this out is to do Romanian deadlifts, but only do it as deep as the hamstrings allow. So you go until you feel a full stretch of the hamstring, and then you go back up, making sure you keep the back in a perfectly neutral position. So not only do the muscles around the low back help support the spine, but the muscles around the core help as well. When we're lifting heavy, we need to make sure that we engage these muscles in order to help support the back. Imagine you're trying to pull your belly button back towards you and then maintain that contraction the whole time. This will help keep the intra-abdominal pressure high, and that will help keep the low back stable. Which brings us to the topic of weightlifting belts. In my opinion, unless you're trying to lift the maximum weight that you can, you probably don't need to use the belt. The reason you wear it when you're maxing out is because this will minimize your risk of injury during the lift. What will happen if we use it all the time is that people almost become reliant on that. Because we have the belt, you don't need to activate your core muscles the way we talked about before to help stabilize the back. Now, when the body performs any sort of movement, the muscles that all fire together tend to fire together every time you do it. If you have a belt, you're not firing your core muscles, meaning that when you're deadlifting, you're using the belt as a crutch. So translate this into a real world example of trying to move a heavy piece of furniture. Your leg muscles will activate just like you're deadlifting, but your core will not unless you have the belt. So I'm of the belief that only use the belt if you're trying to max out. Otherwise, you would probably be better served to lift less weight, but do so while maintaining a stable core through muscle activation, as this will help provide increased core stability throughout the rest of your life, which you do not get when you use the belt. If you're like me and you like to keep track of all your workouts so you know what you lifted one day and then you can progress from that, the time of day you lift actually does matter. The reason is that throughout the day, our body will actually get stronger the more awake we are. So in the morning, if you lift, you are weaker than if you lift late in the afternoon. A real world example of this would be, say, some afternoon you lifted 5 reps for whatever your max is for 5 reps. The next week, you try and do the exact same thing because you're trying to get stronger, but you're lifting early in the morning. If you do this in the morning, your low back and core muscles will not be as strong as they would be in the afternoon. The more reps you go, the quicker you will fatigue, eventually placing yourself at risk of injury if you try and get that 5th rep. An easy solution for this is to set aside a specific time of day that you lift and then try and keep that consistent week to week. Thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something helpful. If you did, you might like this other video where I talk about low back pain when squatting.